Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today is another episode of reviewing NHL teams so far, as today we're going to be talking about the Minnesota Wild as they have been pulling off some weird and wacky and wild, crazy offseason. That's the way I could put it for the Minnesota Wild's offseason. But we're going to be going real in depth. But before we get into that, I'd like to just say, if you are new to the channel, make sure to slap that subscribe button and the like button, as I make videos practically like this every single day. Also, if you are interested, I have a Twitch channel as well, which I go live on it ever so often, and I play some video games, sometimes watch some hockey, and stuff like that. It is a lot of fun. So if you want to check that out, the link are all down in the description below. So let's get into today's video talking about the Minnesota Wild, as they have a new GM in Bill Guerin, who was hired last year on August 22nd. So he's almost been, he's been here since, a full year now. He's been a GM, a year and 3 months. And Bill Guerin has done, I guess, some questionable deals over his tenure. Not really questionable, just some weird moves that you really don't see as a GM, which we are going to be really getting into just about everything. So we're going to start the things off at draft day. His very first draft day as a GM, and I was impressed. Getting Marco Rossi is the biggest change they could, the biggest guy they could ever pick up. A guy that produced so much. I cannot believe the Buffalo Sabres. Jack Quinn's a great player, but he needs to be playing alongside of, he played alongside of Marco Rossi. Marco Rossi had 39 goals, 81 assists, and 120 points. This is a player that the Minnesota Wild have been dying for. I don't think we've ever really talked about Minnesota having a number one centerman of the future. Sure, you had Marian Gaborik. Sure, you had some other guys, but you never had a for sure number one player, and that's Marco Rossi. A great defenseman. I think that's defense. Another centerman here in Marit, who's doing decent. He's been all over the place in the KHL, now in the MHL, I think, but he's producing there 14 points in 10 games. So another great selection. Ryan O'Rourke, a big-time defenseman. So they've done really good with this year's draft. Not just that, they got picks going into next year. They got 2 firsts, they got 2 thirds. They're a decent-looking team, but they got a lot of picks that are going to be helping them build for the future. And that's the biggest thing I think Bill Guerin wanted to bring into this team, is that they needed future players. They really did. Right, picking up what they did here, trading away Jason Zucker, which, it was a good player that they traded away, but, I mean, you get a maybe player in Goaltending. Not just that, you get a first-round pick, and who knows how well the Pittsburgh Penguins will do next year. Will they be a playoff team with that trash-ass defensive core that they do have? Will they make it to the playoffs? And if they don't, well, then you get a lottery pick and a very star-studded defensive draft. And that might potentially help you out for the future of your defensive core, right? You already have a really solid defensive core here with Brodin, Dumpa, Suter, Spurgeon, Saucy, Patron, I think his name is, and Hunt. I mean, stacked defensively. But this team, Minnesota, man, we'll talk about the first trade. Nick Bjugstad for a conditional 7th-round pick. Now, this was a weird one, but I think the reason why Minnesota Wild did this one was, as you guys can see here, he was the assistant GM of the Pittsburgh Penguins, was probably doing them a favor, which I think a lot of these deals were. Like I said in the Perlos video with the Minnesota Wild and Nashville Predators trade, which was a really weird deal. Nick Benino, way older than Luke Kunin, but Luke Kunin came off a struggling year. Perlo is saying that Luke Kunin has kind of struggled in the Minnesota Wild locker room, and I was like, well, remember way back then, the Kevin Fiala for Mikael Granlund move. Kevin Fiala was a young player coming into league. He wasn't really producing as what he was doing pretty damn well, but I mean, he wasn't the best player for Nashville, right? He wasn't producing as much, and he came to Minnesota and ripped things up. He was really that big goal scorer that the Minnesota Wild been looking for, and Kevin Fiala turned into that guy that he was drafted for. But that was kind of like a favor move, right? I mean, you give him Mikael Granlund, who is a guy that's going to be a now player for Nashville Predators, because they were going for a playoff spot, but now they have kind of taken a step back, and that's why I think this deal went through. It was just returning a favor. You give them a young player, you get a young player practically, right? You still got a nice decent amount of picks in a second and a third, which ended up being 2 solid prospects for the Minnesota Wild. I think he went off to Detroit. I think, yeah, that pick went off to Detroit, which was right here. They got the 3rd round pick there. So, yeah, bunch of moves by Bill Guerin, and I really liked all the moves that he did. It was really, really smart, especially this one. And I know people are like, Nick Benino's old, what about Luke Kunin? But Luke Kunin wasn't really producing for them. Nick Benino is going to bring in that veteran leadership. He's a red hot guy when it comes to playoff time. He really is. He's a big time producer, and I think he'll definitely bring that for the Minnesota Wild. Now, will he be a second line guy? No. Will he be a third line guy? Hell yeah. He is definitely going to be their third line guy. But the problem is, do you really want Marcus Johansen playing as your centerman, which will be a great segue towards the next trade. That was another weird one. Eric Stahl for Marcus Johansen. This was a weird one. Marcus Johansen's been struggling. Now, if you're going to be getting a guy that will be producing like how he was in Washington, great. But he wasn't. He is really not that great looking analytically compared to what Eric Stahl is. Eric Stahl was a really good forward for the Florida Panthers and a solid centerman for the team, especially for that first line. But I think the way that they were looking at it, maybe Bill Guerin was just looking for a complete overhaul of the roster, which he really did. It is really a whole overhaul. You had Nick Bjugstad. You add in Benino, Johansen, Kaprizov might be making his debut this year. So just tons of changes, and I loved every single trade, especially getting rid of Devin Dubnyk's deal. Yeah, you had to retain some of his contract, but I mean, you got some money, and you only had to pay him for that year. But you got rid of Devin Dubnyk. That releases a roster spot for Cam Talbot, which will now be a perfect segue towards free agency, which the Minnesota Wild were pretty quiet. They got Greenway back on a $2.1 million deal, and if he keeps developing the way that he's developing, Jordan Greenway will turn out to be a really good player for the Minnesota Wild, and hopefully he'll take that big jump up. He's a big guy, he's a big power forward, and he's a very highly touted prospect for the Minnesota Wild. Cam Talbot, a lot of people were like, why Cam Talbot? Why not sign anyone else? And the reason why is that no one really wants to go and play in Minnesota. Not very many people, and probably Cam Talbot was one of the only goalies that was really available, and that was for cheap, and didn't want very much return. 3 years, not too bad. I mean, it's kind of rough since he is 33 years old, and that might come back to bite him in the ass. If he does not produce like how he was in Calgary, he had a great playoffs. He's a great playoff performer. So once he maybe get into the playoffs, especially with that stacked Central Division, it's going to be very hard for them. Carson Saucy, great signing. He's a great defenseman. Honestly, his analytics look really pretty solid, and he didn't do that bad this year. He had some great years in the AHL, and I'm expecting Carson Saucy to keep developing. And also, he got Jonas Brodin to a 7-year, $6 million deal, which is another great deal. Jonas Brodin, great future guy, not future guy, but a great defenseman for the Minnesota Wild. And this is what the roster looks like. And honestly, it's not that bad. I mean, it's definitely a weird looking roster. When you first look at it, it's a really weird roster, and I honestly don't expect this team to make it to the playoffs. I'm going to say that right now. Unless you have Kaprizov absolutely rip everyone's head off and he just pops off, then sure. But I don't see this team doing very well. They were great defensively, and that's what they're going to be good at. They're going to be hella good defensively. Especially adding Nick Benino and Nick Bjugstad. But I mean, everyone on this team is going to be very good defensively. Eriksson, great. Greenway, not that bad. Kevin Fiala, the first line, definitely going to be pure offense. But we'll have to honestly see what this team does. I'm going to give it a B+. I think Bill Guerin did a lot of good stuff. Sure, did he lose out in the Eric Stahl trade? Yes, without a doubt. Did he lose in the Luke Kunin trade? Not really. They got a great guy, Nick Benino, especially since he's only going to be here for a year, and then you get rid of his contract. Maybe you get Marco Rossi, or you just keep developing. I think this team either will be going after a rebuilding kind of phase. I'm not too sure what they're going to be doing. My recommendation is just to take it slow. Let Marco Rossi develop, because once you get Marco Rossi up in there, once you get that solid number one centerman there in Minnesota, this team's going to be great. And you look at a lot of the contracts, I think they are aiming for 2021. They get rid of Nick Bjugstad. They get rid of Nick Benino. They get rid of Marcus Foligno. Eriksson Ek is expired. Fiala and Marcus Johansen all have expiring contracts. And, I mean, they were looking to trade Matt Dumba, but they weren't able to get that done. But they were looking a little bit too much. And that's because right-handed defensemen are just way overrated, overvalued. But I'm going to give this team a B+. The goaltending is a little sketchy. Cam Talbot and Stahl, both 33 years old. Now, if they split the net, I feel like it could be very good. But it could come back to bite them in the ass later on in the years, especially since they're two very old goalies. Their defense core, still not bad. I like the way that they did things with signing everyone. Spurgeon, great contract. Suter, Dumpa, but still a very solid defense core. Offense, they improved. I mean, not really without him, Nick Bjugstad, but really improved with Benino. Who knows about Kaprizov? And Johansen, if he's able to produce. He's not a centerman, just letting you guys know. John and us were having a conversation about how he's not a centerman. He really isn't. But if he produces for the Minnesota Wild, he produces, and that's good. But I'm going to end the video here, guys. Tell me, guys, what you guys will give for the Minnesota. What type of grade will you give Minnesota? I'm going to end the video here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Adios, amigos.